There are things known and there are things unknown, and in between are the doors of perception. Aldous Huxley. Strasbourg, July 1518. Her name was Frau Trophäa. We don't know her first name. History, as it so often does with women of the medieval period, gave us only the family name, and even that we have only because of what she did next, which was so strange and so terrifying and so impossible to explain that the city authorities of Strasbourg, a prosperous trading city in what is now northeastern France, felt compelled to write it down. On a morning in mid-July 1518, Frau Trophäa walked out of her house onto the street. Some accounts say it was a narrow lane near the city's tannery district, hot and close, and smelling of the river. And she began to dance. Not the joyful dancing of a celebration, not the communal dancing of a festival. She danced alone, in the street, with no music, with no audience that she seemed to acknowledge, with no apparent reason, and with no apparent ability to stop. Her husband watched. Neighbors watched. By the end of that first day, Frau Trophäa was still dancing. Her feet were bleeding. Her face was blank. She showed no sign of stopping. By the end of the first week, she had been joined by 34 others. By the end of the month, the number was between 200 and 400. The sources disagree, but all of them agree that what was happening in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 was unlike anything that anyone had ever seen or would ever see again. Hundreds of people, men and women and children, dancing in the streets, in the squares, in the great hall of the guild houses, dancing until their feet bled and their hearts gave out, and they collapsed in the road, and sometimes did not get up again, dancing without music, without joy, without apparent will, screaming as they danced, according to some accounts, screaming for someone to stop them, begging for release from something they could not name or control. The authorities of Strasbourg, confronted with a crisis that had no precedent and no obvious solution, made a series of decisions that, with the benefit of 5 centuries of hindsight, seem almost incomprehensibly wrong. They hired musicians to play for the dancers. They cleared the guild halls so there would be more room to dance. They brought in professional dancers to keep the afflicted company. They genuinely believed, drawing on the medical understanding of their time, that the best cure for a dancing mania was to dance it out, to keep dancing, until the madness exhausted itself and departed. It did not work. People kept dying. The summer of 1518 in Strasbourg was, by some estimates, killing as many as 15 people a day at the height of the plague. And the question that haunted the city then, and that haunts historians now, is the same question. What was actually happening? To understand the dancing plague of 1518, you have to understand the world that produced it, and the world that produced it was one of the most nightmarish periods in the history of Western Europe, a fact that is not incidental to the story, but absolutely central to it. Strasbourg in 1518 sat at the confluence of several ongoing catastrophes. The region of Alsace had been experiencing famine conditions for years, following a series of failed harvests. The winter of 1517-1518 had been particularly brutal, and the spring that followed it brought flooding rather than relief. Food was scarce. The peasant population was surviving on a diet that modern nutritionists would describe as dangerously deficient in nearly everything: protein, vitamins, calories. People were not merely hungry, they were chronically malnourished in ways that affected their cognition, their emotional regulation, and their physical resilience. The plague, the actual plague, the Black Death and its descendants, was a living memory and an ongoing threat. The great epidemic of the 14th century had killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population, and the subsequent 2 centuries had seen repeated outbreaks in major cities. Strasbourg had been hit multiple times. The city's residents had grown up with death as a constant, indeterminate presence, the kind of presence that distorts the psychological landscape of an entire civilization, making the boundary between the living and the dead more permeable, making the idea of divine punishment for collective sin not a theological abstraction, but a felt, visceral possibility. Economically, the situation was catastrophic. The guild system was under pressure. Small artisans and tradespeople were being squeezed between the rising costs of raw materials and the falling prices that larger merchants could offer for finished goods. Debt was widespread. The gap between the wealthy merchant class and the laboring poor was wider than it had been a century earlier, and the mechanisms for managing that gap, the charitable institutions, the church's social role, the guild systems of mutual protection, were all under strain. And then there was the particular spiritual terror of the age. This was 1518, the year after Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg, and the Christian world was beginning the long, violent fracture of the Reformation. The church that had provided the psychological framework of European life for 1,000 years was visibly cracking. The moral authority of priests was being questioned openly. The certainties on which ordinary people had built their understanding of the world, sin, salvation, the intercession of saints, the power of the church to mediate between human beings and God, were all suddenly terrifyingly uncertain. Into this world, hungry, plague-haunted, economically desperate, spiritually disoriented, came Frau Trophäa, dancing in the street. Here is the thing that makes the dancing plague of 1518 simultaneously more and less mysterious than it first appears. It was not unique. Medieval Europe had seen dancing manias before. The earliest documented case is usually dated to 1021 in the German town of Kölbig, where a group of peasants reportedly danced uncontrollably in a churchyard on Christmas Eve and were cursed by the local priest to continue dancing for a full year. This story has the quality of folk legend more than historical record, and historians treat it accordingly. But by the 13th century, the incidents become more solidly documented and more frequent. In 1237, a large group of children in Erfurt, Germany, reportedly danced their way from their town to the neighboring city of Arnstadt, a distance of several miles, unable to stop until they collapsed from exhaustion. In 1278, approximately 200 people danced on a bridge over the Meuse River in Germany until the bridge collapsed, and many of them drowned, still apparently unable to stop moving. In 1374, an outbreak of dancing mania swept through several cities along the Rhine River, Aachen, Cologne, Metz, affecting thousands of people who danced in the streets for days and weeks, seeing visions, screaming, foaming at the mouth. The 1374 Rhine outbreak was significant enough to be recorded by multiple independent chroniclers, and their descriptions are consistent in their disturbing detail. The dancers appeared to be in a state of altered consciousness, neither fully awake nor asleep, apparently experiencing visions. Many screamed the names of demons. Many seemed to be in extreme pain and yet continued to dance. Some reportedly saw visions of blood and fire. When they collapsed from exhaustion and were doused with water to revive them, they immediately began dancing again. These outbreaks have a collective name in the historical literature, choreomania, or St. Vitus dance, named after the Christian martyr, whose shrine at Zabern was associated with miraculous cures for the affliction. The name tells us something important. Medieval people understood these outbreaks as a unit, a recognizable phenomenon with a cause, divine punishment, demonic possession, the malevolent power of St. Vitus himself, and a potential remedy, pilgrimage to the saint's shrine, exorcism, prayer. What they did not have was an explanation that would satisfy a modern scientist, and it is the search for that explanation that brings us to the most fascinating part of the story. The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. Albert Einstein. For most of the 20th century, the dominant scientific explanation for the dancing plagues of medieval Europe was ergotism, poisoning by the ergot fungus, Claviceps purpurea, which infects rye grain under specific damp conditions and produces a family of compounds that are in concentrated form, essentially identical in their effects to LSD. The ergot theory is elegant and compelling. Ergot poisoning, also known as St. Anthony's fire for the burning sensation it causes in the limbs, was a genuine and documented scourge of medieval Europe, particularly in wet years when grain stored in damp conditions was especially vulnerable to fungal contamination. Its symptoms include convulsions, hallucinations, a burning sensation in the extremities, involuntary muscle spasms, and altered states of consciousness that could last for days. In severe cases, ergotism causes gangrene, madness, and death. It is, by any measure, a plausible candidate for a condition that made people behave as though they had lost control of their own bodies. The historian Linda Caporael famously applied the ergot theory not just to the dancing plagues, but to the Salem witch trials of 1692, arguing that the afflicted girls, whose testimony sent 19 people to the gallows, may have been experiencing genuine ergot-induced hallucinations and convulsions, rather than performing possession for social or political reasons. This application of the theory generated enormous controversy and remains disputed, but it demonstrated the explanatory power of ergotism as a historical lens. Applied to the dancing plagues, the ergot theory works like this. The dancers were not dancing voluntarily. They were experiencing the convulsive, spasmodic muscular contractions that ergot poisoning causes in the limbs, movements that looked to observers like dancing, but that were in fact the involuntary physical expression of a neurological assault on the body's motor systems. The visions, the screaming, the apparent trance state, all consistent with the hallucinogenic properties of ergot alkaloids. It is a good theory. It has the virtue of being grounded in real biochemistry, in documented historical phenomenon, in a mechanism that we can trace from the contaminated grain field to the dancing body in the street. But it has problems, serious ones. The first problem is contagion. Ergot poisoning affects people who eat contaminated grain. It is a food poisoning, not an infectious disease. But the dancing plagues spread in ways that do not fit a food poisoning model. They spread by proximity and by observation. When Frau Trophäa began dancing, the people who joined her were not necessarily eating from the same contaminated supply. They were people who saw her dancing, and then, mysteriously, began to dance themselves. The outbreak moved through the city the way a social phenomenon moves, not the way a food-borne pathogen moves. The second problem is geography and timing. Ergot contamination requires specific conditions, damp weather, certain grain storage practices that would be expected to affect a wide geographic area more or less simultaneously. But the dancing plagues were highly localized. They struck one city while neighboring cities were unaffected. They erupted suddenly and ended suddenly, not following the gradual arc of a seasonal contamination. The third problem is the most interesting one. The dancers knew they were dancing. Ergot poisoning, in its convulsive form, produces involuntary movements that the person experiencing them cannot control or direct. But medieval accounts of the dancing plagues describe dancers who were moving with apparent intention, following paths through the city, responding to music, sometimes calling out to others to join them. They were not seizing. They were, in some meaningful sense, dancing. The explanation that has gained the most traction among modern historians and psychologists is both simpler and stranger than ergot: mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, sometimes called mass sociogenic illness, in the more careful clinical language that researchers prefer because hysteria carries too much baggage. Mass psychogenic illness is a real, well-documented phenomenon. It occurs when groups of people, typically people who share a specific social context of stress, fear, or trauma, begin to display physical symptoms that have no identifiable organic cause. The symptoms spread through a group the way contagion spreads, by observation, by shared belief, by the power of the social environment to shape individual physical experience. The modern world has its own versions of this. In 1962, workers in a textile factory in the American South began experiencing nausea, numbness, and weakness after reports of a strange smell in the factory. The outbreak spread rapidly through the workforce. Investigators found no toxic substance. What they found was a workforce under enormous economic pressure. The factory was recently integrated, tensions were high, job security was uncertain, and a community of people whose shared stress had found a physical expression that was, paradoxically, both real and psychological at the same time. In 2011, a group of teenage girls in Leroy, New York, began experiencing involuntary tics, verbal outbursts, and seizure-like episodes. The outbreak spread from person to person within the school community. Medical investigation found no neurological or environmental cause. What researchers identified was a community dealing with significant stress and a symptom pattern that spread through social networks. The girls who knew each other best were most likely to develop symptoms. Those on the periphery of the social group rarely did. These are mild, modern examples. Now imagine the same mechanism operating in a community experiencing not workplace tension and school social pressures, but famine, plague, existential religious uncertainty, and the perpetual proximity of death. Imagine a population so traumatized by its circumstances that its collective nervous system is primed for exactly this kind of catastrophic release. Imagine a community that already has a cultural framework, the choreomania tradition, the story of St. Vitus, that provides a ready-made narrative for what happens when people lose control of their own bodies in exactly this specific way. The historian John Waller, whose book A Time to Dance, A Time to Die is the most comprehensive modern account of the 1518 Strasbourg outbreak, argues that the dancing plague was a textbook case of mass psychogenic illness operating in the most extreme conditions imaginable. Frau Trophia, he suggests, was a real individual in real psychological distress, possibly in a dissociative state brought on by the accumulated trauma of her circumstances, who expressed that distress through movement. And because her community was primed by the same traumas and the same cultural narratives, her expression became contagious. Here is where the story becomes genuinely philosophical, because the mass psychogenic illness explanation, while scientifically sound, raises a question that is harder to answer than it might appear. What exactly is the relationship between what people believe and what their bodies do? Medieval Europeans believed with complete sincerity in the power of St. Vitus to afflict people with dancing mania as divine punishment for sin. They believed that demons could inhabit human bodies and force them to perform involuntary movements. They believed that the moral state of a community, its accumulated sins, its collective failures of piety and goodness, could manifest in physical catastrophes that affected the entire population. These beliefs were not mere superstition in the dismissive sense that word usually carries. They were the operating system of the medieval world, the framework through which people understood cause and effect, the narrative structure that gave meaning to suffering. When bad things happened to people, the question they asked was not, what physical mechanism produced this result, but what moral failure invited this punishment? The two questions are not equivalent. They do not produce the same answers, and, critically, they do not produce the same bodies. The medical historian Edward Shorter has argued that different historical eras produce different forms of psychosomatic illness, and that the specific form the illness takes is shaped by the cultural narratives available to the person experiencing it. In the 19th century, when the dominant narrative of female suffering was hysteria, a wandering uterus disrupting the nervous system, women presented to doctors with paralysis, blindness, inability to speak, globus hystericus, the sensation of a ball in the throat. In the 20th century, when the dominant narrative shifted to trauma and psychological injury, the same population of patients presented with flashbacks, dissociation, and complex post-traumatic syndromes. The body, in other words, speaks the language of its culture. It expresses distress through the forms that its cultural environment makes available and meaningful. In medieval Strasbourg, in a culture saturated with the image of St. Vitus's dance, in a community that had heard stories of choreomania for generations, the culturally available form of mass distress expression was dancing. So people danced. This does not make the dancing less real. The blood on Frau Trofea's feet was real. The deaths were real. The suffering was real. The dancing was the body's way of saying something that the culture had not given these people the language to say directly. The decision by Strasbourg's authorities to hire musicians and provide more space for the dancers is one of those historical moments that seems, from the outside, like pure lunacy, and yet makes complete sense when you understand the framework of belief that produced it. The authorities consulted physicians. The physicians, drawing on the Galenic medical theory that dominated European medicine at the time, concluded that the dancers were suffering from an overheated blood, a condition that could only be resolved by completing the process that had begun, by dancing out the hot blood until it cooled. Stopping the dancers by force in this framework would be like trying to stop a fever by cooling the skin from outside. You might reduce the surface temperature, but the underlying heat would remain and would find another outlet. The authorities also consulted astrologers, who identified a malevolent planetary conjunction as the cause. And they consulted clergy, who were divided between those who saw the dancing as demonic possession requiring exorcism and those who attributed it to the curse of St. Vitus and recommended pilgrimage to his shrine. What nobody consulted, because they did not yet exist, was a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or anyone with even a rudimentary understanding of how psychological distress spreads through social networks. The concept of mass psychogenic illness would not be scientifically articulated for another 3 centuries. The authorities of Strasbourg were not stupid. They were dealing with an impossible situation using the best tools their civilization had developed. The tools were simply the wrong tools for the job. Their interventions made the outbreak worse in exactly the way that providing a validating, supportive environment for psychosomatic illness tends to make it worse. By sending the implicit message that the dancing was real, that it was expected, that the city recognized it as a genuine affliction, requiring accommodation. The musicians playing for the dancers were not being cruel. They were being compassionate according to the understanding of their time. But compassion without understanding can cause as much harm as indifference. The outbreak ended eventually when the authorities reversed course. Tired of the deaths and the chaos, they banned music, banned public dancing, drove the dancers out of the city to the shrine of St. Vitus at Saverne. There, away from the enabling environment of the city streets, away from the community of dancers who had reinforced each other's symptoms, separated from the social context that had generated the plague in the first place, the dancing slowly stopped. The most dangerous stories we make up are the ones we tell about ourselves, what we can and cannot endure. Brené Brown. The dancing plague of 1518 is the most famous of the medieval choreomania outbreaks, but it is far from the last case of its kind in the historical record. Understanding this history requires following the phenomenon forward in time through its gradual transformation and eventual disappearance, or rather, its eventual transformation into forms we no longer recognize as the same thing. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the gradual medicalization of mass psychogenic illness, As the Church's explanatory monopoly weakened under the pressure of scientific revolution and religious fragmentation, the dancing plague narrative lost its cultural traction. The story of St. Vitus's curse required a population that believed in it, and the population was slowly, unevenly, but irreversibly losing that belief. What replaced it in the medical literature was a new set of narratives: animal magnetism, nervous disorders, the peculiar susceptibility of women to hysteria. The Factory case in 1962, the Leroy girls in 2011, these are the descendants of Frau Troffea. The mechanism is the same. The cultural costume is different, and because the cultural costume is different, we treat them differently, not as divine punishment or demonic possession, but as medical curiosities requiring clinical investigation. The underlying human experience, a community under intolerable stress finding a shared, unconscious physical language for its distress, is identical. What this tells us about the dancing plague is important. It was not a product of medieval irrationality, of primitive superstition, of a darkness that the Enlightenment has since banished. It was a product of human psychology operating under extreme conditions, and human psychology has not changed in 500 years. We are just as capable of generating mass psychogenic illness as the people of 14th century Aachen or 16th century Strasbourg. We just do it differently now, in different costumes, with different narratives to explain what our bodies are doing. Let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to Frau Troffea on the street in July 1518, before the crowd gathered, before the musicians arrived, before the guild halls were cleared, and the city authorities convened their emergency consultations. Let us try to see her as she was, a single human being doing something that no one around her could explain. John Waller, working from the historical record, offers a portrait of Frau Troffea that is heartbreaking in its plausibility. She was likely a woman of the laboring poor, living in the conditions of scarcity and insecurity that characterized life for most of Strasbourg's population in 1518. She may have been recently bereaved. The famine years killed indiscriminately, and loss was the common denominator of medieval life. She was certainly living with chronic stress of the kind that we now understand to be physically as well as psychologically damaging: elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep, nutritional deficiency, the constant low-grade terror of not knowing whether there would be food next month. In this condition, something broke. Not in a metaphorical sense. Something in the regulatory systems of her nervous system failed, producing a dissociative state in which her body began to move without the direction of her conscious will. This is a documented neurological event. Dissociation, the partial or complete separation of conscious awareness from bodily experience, occurs in stressed individuals across all cultures and all historical periods. It can look like a trance, like a faint, like a seizure, or, under the right cultural conditions, like dancing. What made Frau Troffea's dissociative episode into the dancing plague of 1518 was not something in her body. It was something in her world. She lived in a community that had a name for what she was doing, and a story about why it happened, and a set of culturally defined expectations about how it would spread. Her neighbors, watching her from their doorways, were not watching a random medical event. They were watching something they recognized, something they had heard about, something that their culture had told them was contagious, and that recognition, that expectation, made it so. The philosopher Ian Hacking has a concept he calls looping effects, the way that naming and classifying a human behavior can change the behavior itself, because the people performing the behavior become aware of the classification and begin to perform it differently, more consistently, more completely, in ways that align with the cultural narrative surrounding it. Frau Troffea's neighbors didn't just observe her dancing. They observed it through the lens of choreomania, and that lens shaped what they saw, and what they saw shaped what they did, and what they did shaped what happened next. One of the strangest and most revealing aspects of the 1518 outbreak is the role of music in it, both as an attempted cure and almost certainly as a cause of its escalation. The city authorities' decision to hire musicians was not as irrational as it looks from the outside. Medieval medicine understood music as having direct physical effects on the body, as capable of heating or cooling the blood, of calming or exciting the nervous system, of driving out malevolent spirits. The idea that music could cure a condition caused by disordered movement was, within the framework of humoral medicine, a coherent therapeutic approach. You fight fire with fire, the logic went, and you fight disordered dancing with controlled, rhythmic music that gives the dancers something to organize their movements around. What the authorities did not understand, what nobody in 1518 could have understood, is that music is one of the most powerful social synchronizers in human experience. Humans are extraordinarily sensitive to rhythm. Our bodies entrain to external rhythmic signals automatically, without conscious decision. When we hear a regular beat, our hearts begin to align with it, our movement patterns begin to align with it, our emotional states begin to align with the emotional content of the music. This is not a choice. It is a neurological reflex that appears to be fundamental to human sociality, a mechanism that evolved to allow groups of people to coordinate their actions. When the Strasbourg authorities brought musicians to play for the dancers, they were not calming the dancers down. They were providing a powerful rhythmic entrainment signal that pulled more people into the dancing state. The music made it easier to dance, more natural to dance, more rewarding to dance, because moving in synchrony with music produces genuine neurochemical effects, releasing endorphins and dopamine in ways that reinforce the behavior. The authorities were, in effect, accidentally designing the world's worst possible therapeutic intervention, providing a neurochemical reward for the very behavior they were trying to eliminate. There is a cruel irony here that the people of Strasbourg could not see. The musicians they hired to help the dancers were helping them dance themselves to death with greater efficiency. A detail that historians have only recently begun to examine carefully is the demographic composition of the dancers. The available sources suggest that the dancing plague of 1518 was predominantly, though not exclusively, a phenomenon of the poor and the dispossessed. The wealthy merchant families of Strasbourg are largely absent from the accounts of the dancing. The guildmasters, the city councilors, the wealthy burghers, they watched, they consulted, they made policy. They were not among those collapsing in the streets with bleeding feet. The people dancing were those already at the bottom of the city's social hierarchy: day laborers, female textile workers, the urban poor, the marginally housed. This is not an accident. Mass psychogenic illness, the historical and clinical evidence consistently shows, disproportionately affects people who are under the greatest social and economic stress, who have the least social power, and who have the fewest legitimate outlets for expressing their distress. It is a condition of the oppressed, not the privileged. It strikes people who cannot strike back, who cannot protest, who cannot petition, who cannot leave, who have no mechanism for converting their suffering into change. The dancing was, in this reading, a kind of protest that the body makes when all conscious forms of protest have been foreclosed. The tanners and textile workers of Strasbourg could not riot. The penalties were too severe. They could not petition the city council. They had no standing. They could not leave. They had nowhere to go. What they could do, in the language their culture made available to them, was surrender to the saint's curse, abandon the control of their bodies, become the dancing dead. This reading does not deny the genuine suffering of the dancers. It does not suggest they were consciously performing or manipulating anyone. Psychogenic illness is real illness with real physical consequences. But it adds a layer of political meaning to the event that the pure medical explanation tends to flatten. These were not simply sick people. They were people made sick by a society that had pushed them to the absolute limits of human endurance, and their illness was, in some profound sense, a testimony to what had been done to them. If you think the dancing plague is a medieval curiosity with no relevance to the present, consider what happened in Kosovo in 1990. In the final years of Serbian dominance over the Albanian majority population, a strange illness swept through the Albanian school population. Hundreds of children experienced sudden weakness, dizziness, nausea, and fainting. The outbreak spread from school to school. Serbian authorities attributed it to Albanian poisoning, a political accusation. Albanian community members believed it was Serbian chemical warfare. International investigators found no toxin, no pathogen, no environmental cause. What they found was a community under extreme political oppression, living with constant fear and uncertainty, with no legitimate outlet for collective distress. The children's illness was the body's response to an unbearable social situation. It was, in every meaningful way, the dancing plague wearing different clothes in a different century. Or consider the Pokemon shock of 1997, when a particular episode of the animated series triggered seizure-like symptoms in nearly 700 Japanese children. The initial cause, a flashing light sequence that triggered genuine photosensitive reactions in a small number of children, was real. But the subsequent spread of symptoms far exceeded what the physical stimulus could account for. Children who had not been exposed to the light sequence, children who had been watching different channels, began reporting symptoms. The outbreak spread through the news coverage of the outbreak, a beautiful and terrible demonstration of the power of social contagion. These modern cases matter because they close the distance we tend to maintain between ourselves and the people of medieval Strasbourg. We look at Frau Trophea and we see someone trapped in ignorance and superstition, someone whose suffering we understand better than she did, someone from whom we are separated by 5 centuries of scientific progress. But Kosovo 1990 and Leroy 2011 and Pokemon 1997 are not medieval. They are us. They are the same mechanism operating in our bodies, in our communities, in our schools and factories and oppressed communities. We have not escaped the dancing plague. We have just renamed it. The dancing plague of 1518 ended, as such outbreaks tend to end, not with understanding, but with exhaustion. The dancers were removed from the city, the music was stopped, the enabling environment was dismantled, and the plague simply ran out of fuel. Nobody in Strasbourg in the autumn of 1518 had learned anything lasting about why it had happened or how to prevent it from happening again. The city went back to its ordinary catastrophes: the famine, the plague, the grinding poverty, and the dancers, those who had survived, went back to their lives. But the event left traces. It was recorded by multiple chroniclers. It was discussed by physicians across Europe. It became part of the medical literature of the 16th century, cited in debates about the nature of the body and the power of the mind. Sebastian Brandt, the Strasbourg humanist who had written The Ship of Fools just decades earlier, was alive during the outbreak. The connection between that great satirical work, its portrait of a world in which foolishness and self-destruction were universal, and the spectacle of his city's dancing dead, is not one that historians have failed to notice. The plague also left a visual legacy. Peter Bruegel the Elder painted Pilgrimage of the Epileptics to the church at Molenbeek around 1564, depicting a group of peasant dancers being led by nuns, a direct reference to the choreomania tradition. The image is simultaneously compassionate and disturbing. The dancers' faces blank, their movements mechanical. The nuns attending them with an air of resigned pragmatism. Bruegel had grown up hearing about the dancing plagues. His image is the first attempt to capture what that experience looked like from the outside, and its uncanniness, its sense of movement that is simultaneously human and inhuman, has lost none of its power. The honest answer is yes. Not in the same form, we no longer have the cultural substrate of St. Vitus's curse, the dancing saint, the ready-made narrative of divine punishment through involuntary movement. But the underlying conditions that produce mass psychogenic illness have not been eliminated from human life. What the dancing plague of 1518 requires is a community under extreme, chronic, collective stress, a culturally available narrative that provides a script for how that stress manifests physically, a social environment that validates and enables the physical expression of distress rather than addressing its causes, and a population that has been pushed past the point where individual coping strategies are sufficient, where the body must speak because the mind and the voice have been silenced. These conditions exist in the modern world. They exist in displaced populations, in communities under economic collapse, in environments of political oppression, in schools and workplaces where stress is normalized and help is unavailable. The specific form that mass psychogenic illness takes in these communities will be shaped by the specific cultural narratives available. And our culture offers many narratives of physical suffering, of contamination, of mysterious illness, of vulnerability to external forces. We are not as far from Frau Troffea as we think. The same human nervous system that drove her out into the street in July 1518 is the nervous system you are using right now to process these words. The same capacity for social contagion, for the collective unconscious expression of intolerable experience, for the body speaking when the voice falls silent. All of it is still here, still present, still waiting for the right conditions. The dancing plague ended. The human conditions that made it possible did not. We do not know what happened to Frau Troffea after the plague ended. The historical record that briefly captured her, that one extraordinary moment when her dancing made her visible to the city authorities who wrote things down, does not follow her afterward. She disappeared back into the anonymity of the Strasbourg poor, into the vast silent majority of medieval lives that left no trace. Perhaps she recovered fully and lived out her years in the ordinary way, carrying whatever she carried before July 1518, whatever it was that broke that morning and sent her out into the street. Perhaps the dancing had been a release of some kind, a purge of something too heavy to bear any other way, and she was lighter for it in the strange, costly way that crises sometimes leave people lighter. Or perhaps she was one of the ones who didn't stop. Perhaps the plague took her, ground her down through those weeks of summer until her heart gave out on the cobblestones of a Strasbourg street, still moving, still unable to explain what she was doing or why. We don't know. History gave us her name and then took it back. But for a few weeks in the summer of 1518, Frau Troffea was the most visible person in Strasbourg, the woman whose body said loudly and publicly, and at the cost of everything, what no one else in the city could find the language to say, that something was wrong, that the world had become unbearable, that human beings, pushed far enough, will find ways to scream that no one can silence, because the scream comes from somewhere deeper than the voice. She danced. The city watched. And 500 years later, we are still trying to understand what she was trying to tell us.